That morning, the sort of uneasy stillness that can settle over a frontier town before a storm. Folk ambled along the warped boardwalks and dirt streets, collars turned high, even though summer still held the sun overhead. The wind hadn't quite risen to a howl. It whispered instead a soft cutting murmur that made folks hold their tongues and their secrets. Wyatt Granger rode into Ironwood Gulch with little on his mind, except procuring a sack of oats and a replacement spoke for his busted wagon wheel. He wasn't looking for a ruckus. Tall in the saddle with more dust than vanity clinging to his weathered coat, he exuded a kind of silence that few men could maintain. Since losing everything he cherished, his wife, his small spread on the outskirts of the territory, Wyatt had realized that words often brought grief. Quiet was safer. Quiet demanded no explanation. He dismounted near the side of Denton's livery, ignoring the curious glances from a pair of ranch hands leaning against a post. They might have recognized him from an earlier time, back when he tried to salvage a dying farm and a faltering mortgage. But nobody asked questions now. The hush was too complete, too unnatural to risk conversation. Instead, their gazes flicked beyond him toward a cramped alley behind the saloon. Whispers passed among them, faint as the breeze. Wyatt caught the shape of an alleyway, gathering perhaps half a dozen forms, huddled like watchers around some spectacle. No laughter came from that group, no idle banter, just a stifled tension, as if they stood around a saloon fight that had turned sour. Usually Wyatt Granger minded his own business with the fervor of a man who'd been burned. But something about that knot of onlookers stirred in him. A prickling along the back of his neck told him trouble brewed. They're possibly the kind that preyed on the helpless. He tied his horse loosely an old mare with more sway in her back than pride in her step, and ambled toward the alley. Each footstep felt heavier, as though he trod a path fate had set. The hush deepened as he neared. He found them behind dusty crates and rusted tin spittoons, an impromptu gathering around a single battered figure, a woman. She wore a homespun dress stained by travel and grief, the hem crusted with old mud. One hand rested protectively against the curve of her belly, unmistakably heavy with child. The other hung limp at her side, her hair a muddled gold drooped in tangled strands that framed a face more numb than weeping. Standing close by were two men who reeked of sour whiskey and sharper cruelty. Brothers or so, he'd learned soon enough, though, not blood brothers to the woman. They spoke in low voices, bartering. A stocky, greasy-fingered merchant lingered with them, eyeing the pregnant woman as though she were livestock. Healthy enough, one of the men muttered, "Baby near to term, she can cook clean and not raise a fuss. Won't you give us some coin so we can settle a family debt?" The merchant sneered. "I'm no charity. If there's a mouth to feed, that's more problem than advantage." One of the in-laws, a bearded, mean-eyed fellow, spat on the ground. "No charity needed. We'll let her go for a fair price. She's got to be worth something to a man that needs a wife with no opinions." A few in the group let out awkward chuckles. But the woman said nothing, her gaze lowered to the dirt. She seemed beyond shame, beyond fear. More like a husk waiting for fate's final blow. Wyatt felt a welling heat in his chest, the slow kind that can kill a man if he doesn't find an outlet. He recalled how he once lost a child, saw that heartbreak break his wife's spirit, watched her pass soon after. Now, seeing the same hollowness in this woman's eyes, he knew he couldn't just turn away. Silence might have been his shield all these months, but some wrongs demanded a voice. Before he realized it, he'd stepped forward. "Put that coin away if you ain't buying." The bearded in-law snapped at the merchant, noticing Wyatt. Another man leaning against a broken barrel flicked a sneer at Wyatt. "Unless you got the nerve to take her, stranger." Their challenge was a goad laced with contempt. The hush of the crowd deepened. Wyatt saw the woman lift her eyes for a brief second. Their gazes locked a moment of raw, shared anguish. No tears in her expression, no plea, just a vacant, battered dignity. He exhaled. How much, he asked, surprising even himself. The bearded man's face twisted into a smirk. $50, he said, almost flippantly. "And a decent rifle if you got one." Another hush broken by a few startled murmurs. Wyatt had never planned on interfering, let alone purchasing someone's future. But life had a way of leading him into battles he never asked for. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small pouch of coins he'd saved for times of dire need. Also, he slipped the battered Winchester from his back. The rifle was all he had left from a father who died under the same roof that foreclosed. He tossed the pouch to the man, who waited in his palm with a mean grin. Then the rifle changed hands, a transaction completed with chilling simplicity. "She's yours," the in-laws declared, stepping away. "Don't say we didn't warn you. She's quiet as a mouse, doesn't talk or fuss. She's kin, but we can't afford her. Good luck." Wyatt moved closer, holding out a hand gently. "Can you walk?" he asked. The pregnant woman stared at his hand, then up at him. Her voice, when it came, was cracked and brittle. "Name's Amelia Dumont." Hearing a name turned her from a commodity into a person. Wyatt felt the world tilt. "Wyatt Granger," he said, simply, voice. Dry. They left that alley in stunned silence. Bystanders stepped aside, refusing to meet Wyatt's glare. He helped Amelia Dumont onto his old mare, then led her from Ironwood Gulch. Those who watched murmured about foolish men and pregnant burdens, about pity and wasted coin. But Wyatt heard none of it. He only saw the haunted woman who needed an out, and he provided it. They rode until dusk along an empty trail. The sun sank in a blaze, leaving the sky streaked red. She neither wept nor demanded answers. He offered none. At a shallow creek bed, they stopped to camp. He lit a small fire, gave her his coat. "You owe me nothing," he said at last. She merely nodded. After a long while, she spoke in a whisper. "Thank you." In that hush of night, as frogs croaked near the creek and a single coyote yipped in the distance, Wyatt realized he might have done something that threatened his own fragile peace. But deep down, he suspected that maybe he'd let a spark of compassion slip through the armor he'd built around his grief. The following morning dawned with a brittle clarity. A chill wind carried the smell of damp sagebrush and the faint tang of pine from the higher slopes. Wyatt rose early, as was his habit, stirring the embers of the small fire until he coaxed fresh flames. He poured water into a dented kettle, set it near the edge of the coals, and waited for it to boil for coffee. Across the dying grass, their mare stood nibbling at a few tufts, the only sign of contentment in a precarious situation. Amelia Dumont emerged from the makeshift tent, a simple arrangement of Wyatt's threadbare blankets stretched between a low branch and the wagon's side. She moved slowly, one hand braced against her belly, the other holding the blanket closed around her shoulders. In daylight, her features appeared even more gaunt. She had bruises on her wrists, likely from the men who'd handled her. Wyatt felt a twinge of anger bubble in his gut. They exchanged tentative greetings. He offered her coffee in a tin cup. She took it with both hands, sipping in silence. For a long moment, all that existed was the gentle crackle of the fire, the shifting of the horse, and the swirl of steam. Then Wyatt said, "This ain't how I plan my day, or my life." She gave a ghost of a nod. She finally set the cup aside. "You shouldn't have done it," she said, voice rasping from disuse. "Now you're tangled in my troubles," Wyatt shrugged. "I've been in trouble before, not so different from this. At least this time, it might help someone." He paused, examining her face. "If you want, I'll drop you off at the next settlement. You can be free." Amelia looked away, eyes flicking to the horizon. "Free for what? Another man to buy me? Another set of in-laws claiming my child? I've got no money, no place to run." The bitterness in her voice cut deep, as though each word was a shard of glass. Wyatt rubbed the back of his neck. He recalled his own predicament after losing his wife. No home worth mentioning, a half-dead ranch he'd had to abandon to the bank, and debts that never quite disappeared. "We'll figure something out," he said softly. "It ain't perfect, but you can stay with me if you choose. I got a small place out near the foothills. Needs repairs, but the roof's mostly good. No one else around." She studied him with suspicion. "And I'd be what, your property?" He shook his head. "You'd be my guest or partner, if that's what you want. I bought you from them to stop them from hurting you, not to own you." He recognized the wryness in his own voice, a leftover from cynicism that had grown in him like a weed, but sincerity shaped his words more than he cared to admit. She let out a faint breath, shoulders sagging as though a colossal weight pressed down. "I don't know how to trust that, but I've run out of choices." He nodded, not pressing. Instead, he fished out a chunk of jerky and half a biscuit from his saddlebag, offering them to her. She ate slow and methodical, no pleasure in the meal, but hunger demanded it. They traveled by midday, the battered wagon squeaking behind the mare. Wyatt had scrimped enough coin to keep the mare fed for a while, but he worried about supplies in the long run. As they rode, a question nagged at him. What if the in-laws had claimed some legal right or sent men to retrieve her Ironwood Gulch? Might be hush about the sale, but such dealings could rouse trouble. Amelia's unborn child was also a factor. Some folks would see an heir as valuable property. Their conversation remained sparse as they took a winding trail away from known routes. He tried to glean more about her past, who she was before that alley, but she answered in short phrases, "My husband died in a fever," or "They said I owed them for his debts." The rest apparently was too raw to speak aloud. Wyatt respected that boundary. He had his own ghosts he seldom named. So, the day stretched on the wagon's wheels, groaning over ruts. Clouds gathered overhead in a lukewarm sky. He pressed the mare gently toward the west, where he knew a wide valley nestled under the shadow of the mountains. His small homestead lay beyond that. They might reach it tomorrow by dusk. A place of crumbling fences, 2 small rooms, and emptiness. He wondered how it would feel to arrive with a new occupant, one carrying a child of uncertain future. Yet as the sun dipped behind the ridges, painting the sky with hints of lavender and gold, Wyatt dared let a flicker of hope surface. Maybe amid all this dust and sorrow, they could carve out a fragile corner of belonging. They spent another night under a scattering of sparse pines, the wind a mild hush through the needles above. A small creek bubbled nearby, offering fresh water to quench thirst and wash dust from hands and faces. Amelia Dumont's shoulders seemed less tense as she knelt by the creek, gently rinsing the ragged hem of her dress. She glanced at Wyatt once, a fleeting look that spoke volumes, uncertainty, gratitude, maybe a flicker of curiosity about him. He busied himself gathering tinder for a modest fire. The more he watched her, the clearer it became that she wasn't fragile by nature. She'd simply been bruised by circumstances. The pregnancy weighed on her both physically and mentally. But behind her, silence was a quiet resolve. Something in that resonated with Wyatt. He'd grown to admire those who faced devastation and did not crumble, for he'd tried to be one of them himself. They rose with dawn as usual and pressed onward. The trail they followed snaked through fields of tall grass gone brown from dryness, occasionally crossing narrow streams that fed from the distant peaks. By midday, the mountains loomed large, a dramatic backdrop of stone and ragged pine. Within that labyrinth of ridges lay Wyatt's old ranch. Not much to see, he remarked, not glancing at her. Better than an alley, Amelia returned softly, though her tone carried no humor. Indeed, better it might be. But Wyatt worried how she'd cope with the isolation. He recalled the dryness of the wind out there, the cracking of paint on the porch, and the memory of his wife's last days. Still no turning back now. As the sun peaked overhead, they came around a bend in the trail to spot a low-roof structure crouched behind a picket fence. It was half collapsed in one corner. An old orchard to the left turned wild with unpruned branches. The main door hung slightly off kilter. A battered barn with a drooping roof stood behind, apparently missing half its shingles. Wyatt felt the old sting of shame. He had once tried to maintain this place for his wife and future child. Fate had other plans. They passed the orchard wheels rattling through ruts of dried mud. Amelia's eyes scanned the property. She said nothing, but Wyatt sensed her registering each detail. The broken fence posts, the sign of a well. Near the front, the skeletal remains of a garden patch. He stopped the wagon in front of the porch, hopped down, then offered a hand to help her. She took it tentatively. The porch creaked beneath their weight. He pushed open the front door, revealing a single main room with a stone fireplace, a few chairs, and a rough dining table. A second smaller room branched off to the left bedroom, though modest, containing a bed with a worn quilt over it. "It's dusty," he muttered. "No one's been around for months. I just come by every so often to make sure no squatters moved in." Amelia released a soft breath. "It's quiet," she said. Her eyes landed on a shelf lined with a few old books. She stepped over, running fingertips along a layer of dust on the spines. "It'll do." She added, her voice subdued but not lifeless. Wyatt exhaled slowly, tension he hadn't realized he carried. Loosening, "We can clear out the cobwebs, fix the barn," he said. "I can sleep in the barn anyway, if that's easier for you." She turned, looking at him with an unreadable expression. "Why would you do that?" "Don't want you feeling I'm pushing you." She thought about it, then shook her head. "This is your house. I'm just—" She trailed off, uncertain. "Our house now if you want it," he said simply, surprising himself. After all, he was no saint, no man of grand compassion. He was just a drifter who once had roots here. Yet something about her vulnerability and muted strength made him want to give her more than a corner to sleep in. She didn't answer, but studied the floor. Outside, a breeze rattled the broken shutters. "We'll see," she finally said. "For now, let's see if there's any water in the well." She brushed past him gently heading out the door, and he caught the faintest whiff of old soap in her hair. He followed, overshadowed by a memory of how his wife Miriam used to move about this same porch with a grace that defied the battered boards. They found the well still functional, albeit requiring a new rope. Water came up brackish at first, but after a few pumps and a bit of elbow grease, it ran clearer. The orchard, half choked with weeds, offered a few stunted apples. Amelia plucked one bit into it without complaint. Wyatt rummaged in the wagon for the meager supplies he had determined they'd need to head back into a nearby hamlet soon to stock up. But for the moment, he let himself stand in the orchard's patchy shade, watching Amelia test each apple for signs of rot or worms. She did so with care and unconscious tenderness that spoke to her hopes for the coming child. A spark of life in her eyes replaced the hollowness he'd seen behind the saloon. In that small glimmer, Wyatt felt something shift in him too. Perhaps it was not too late for second chances, or for sowing seeds in scorched earth. The next day broke with a promise of mild weather, though the sun still rose from behind the rugged mountains like a watchful sentinel. Wyatt and Amelia Dumont fell into a routine more seamlessly than either might have anticipated. He'd rise early, see to the horse, then roam the property for broken fence posts or sections of roofing that demanded immediate repair. She busied herself with small tasks inside, sweeping the dust, airing out the few linens, and discovering how best to manage the stove. At midday, they shared bread and jerky, occasional leftover apples from the orchard's meager bounty. Conversation was sparse but not strained. Each had a share of unspoken griefs that formed an odd kinship. He noticed that when she paused her chores to rest, she'd press both hands around her belly, eyes half closed, as if reassuring the baby all was well. He showed her the side room that had once served as a child's nursery in progress. The faded wallpaper, with a dancing horse motif, still hung in tatters. He'd done that for Miriam so many years ago, hoping for a son or daughter to fill this house with laughter. Instead, the child passed before it could draw breath, and Miriam soon followed. Now, Amelia Dumont gazed at the same peeling wallpaper with a mixture of sadness and longing. She asked for a bucket of warm water and a rag, then started wiping away the cobwebs. Wyatt retreated outside to chop wood, giving her space. The repetitive swing of the axe soothed him, each crack of splitting timber echoing across the yard. The orchard with its crooked branches cast dappled shade upon the overgrown grass. He wondered if she might eventually want to fix it up, plant a small garden, or maybe raise chickens, dreams he once had. Late afternoon found them rummaging through a trunk in the barn. Within, he'd stowed old blankets, a few implements, and a battered cradle he'd carved back in his more hopeful days. It was incomplete, missing a rocker leg, but the shape was sturdy. Amelia brushed her palm along the wooden edges. "We could use this," she said quietly. If the baby thrives." He nodded, not wanting to say too much. Instead, he lifted it carefully, setting it aside to bring into the house. She held a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Just a moment's softness, but enough that Wyatt felt his chest tighten. This was how a woman with hope might look, he thought. The difference from a battered soul behind a saloon was stark. In the evening, they dined on boiled beans and the last of the jerky. She made some cornbread from flour, though it was dense and lacked flavor. They didn't complain. Necessity bred acceptance. After the meal, they sat on the porch, the air cool but not cold. The moon rose faint above the ridge. A moment later, Amelia's voice quiet as a wind through tall grass said, "I never told you about him." My late husband Wyatt listened, unmoving. He was older, not unkind, but always tired. He died from fever, she explained. His kin blamed me, said I wasn't strong enough to tend him right, or that I cursed the family. Nonsense, but her words trailed off. He let a beat pass. "I'm sorry," was all he offered. She nodded, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They turned me out but realized I carried a child. My husband's blood. They saw me as a burden or a commodity. Then that day behind the saloon," she shuddered. I don't know if you rescued me or just delayed more sorrow. But either way, I'm here and I'm grateful." Wyatt exhaled softly. "I've known sorrow that doesn't end, but maybe it can be reshaped." He cleared his throat, glancing at the battered porch railing. "I lost my child, lost my wife. Couldn't face this place after that. But something pushed me to come back to salvage what I could. Guess you're part of that salvage now." Her eyes flicked to him, not offended, but thoughtful. "That's the first time you've mentioned your wife." He nodded, muscles tense. "Miriam," he said simply, the name almost a sigh. "She was bright as a morning star. I failed to keep her alive." "You didn't fail," Amelia said softly, yet firmly, surprising him with a gentle conviction. "Sometimes we can't stop death. We can only keep living." The stillness between them held a strange warmth. They listened to the faint chirp of crickets in the grass. Wyatt felt a small measure of comfort from her words. He hadn't realized how starved he was for any measure of solace. At length he rose. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll make do with a pallet in the corner." She parted her lips as if to protest, but didn't. Perhaps she saw no reason to push. Tiredness weighed heavily on them both, the exhaustion of forging new territory in each other's presence. As they extinguished the lantern, Wyatt paused to watch her retreat to the bedroom. I'm glad you're here," he murmured, almost tripping over the honesty in his own voice. Amelia paused in the doorway, her silhouette lit by the faint glow of the moon. She didn't respond verbally, but she dipped her head in a slight nod, a gesture that said, "Enough." Thus ended their second evening at the ranch, an unspoken arrangement shaping between them. Outside, a mild breeze stroked the orchard's leaves, as though the land once so ravaged by heartbreak was slowly breathing again. Life settled into a rhythm over the next few weeks, at the forsaken ranch near Ironwood Gulch. The orchard regained a semblance of order under Amelia Dumont's careful hands. She hacked away brambles and pruned tangled limbs, all while her belly grew heavier with the child who kicked day and night. Wyatt Granger mended fences, replaced rotting boards on the barn, and restocked the neglected well. Each day ended with shared suppers of beans, bread, and whatever they could scrounge from a still-limited pantry. Though conversation remained sparse, an unspoken bond deepened like two travelers forging a path through the wilderness. But the hush that fell upon them wasn't purely domestic bliss. There were times Amelia would wake in the night, breath caught in her throat, murmuring half-formed pleas to no one. Wyatt would stand by, unsure whether to comfort her or give space. She never asked for his closeness, but sometimes her eyes, haunted by old nightmares, told him that a part of her might want reassurance. He gave it in subtle ways: an extra blanket near the bed, a cup of warm tea when she woke, a gentle question about her well-being. Late one afternoon, a thick cloud of dust appeared along the road. Wyatt paused, hammer in hand, sweat glistening on his brow. He watched as three riders advanced, grim silhouettes against the dusty sky. A cold coil of dread twisted in his gut. He'd known trouble might track them down eventually. Dismounting from those horses were men with the look of stale whiskey and moral rot. One carried a rifle angled across his saddle, another a sly grin that reeked of arrogance. Amelia emerged from the orchard, expression tightening as she recognized them. "My in-laws," she whispered, voice trembling with memories of that alley behind the saloon. Wyatt set aside the hammer, wiping his hands on his trousers as he walked forward. The lead man, bearded and ill-tempered, sneered. "Afternoon, mister. We come to see about our kin." Wyatt stood with an unspoken challenge in his stance. "This is my land, she's my guest. Y'all can keep riding." The man spat a wad of tobacco juice. "Not so simple. She's carrying our brother's child. That child belongs to our bloodline. We have claims." Amelia stiffened beside Wyatt. Her gaze hardened, but her face lost color. "I told you," she said quietly. "You have no claim. You sold me." A younger man behind the bearded one chuckled, the sound as foul as his grin. "Ain't how we see it. We sold your labor, not your womb. Our brother's babe is ours to protect, or so the law might say." Wyatt's heart hammered in a cold fury. "You got a piece of paper says that?" The lead man only smirked. "We don't need paper. We got kinship in a name that child's meant to share." Amelia let out a breath that trembled with anger. "You said I was worthless. You tossed me like refuse. Now you want to lord over a baby you never cared about." The man's jaw flexed. "Mind your tone. You owe us for debts the family incurred. That includes your husband's passing and funeral." Wyatt's lips pressed into a hard line. A recollection of what it felt like to be harassed by men who believed they had rightful claim to your land or your life flared up in him. He'd faced that from bankers, from unscrupulous neighbors. He wasn't about to see Amelia undone by the same brand of corruption. He stepped forward, arms loose at his sides, but ready. "She stays. If you want to push it, I can show you how worthless your threats are." The younger man tensed, hand drifting near his belt, but the bearded one raised a halting gesture. "We'll see about that. We ain't leaving empty-handed. We'll be back with the law, or with guns, maybe both. A hush fell. The orchard's branches rustled under a sudden breeze. Amelia moved closer to Wyatt, her breathing unsteady. "Then come back," Wyatt said, voice quiet, yet resonating with steel. "We'll be ready." Moments later, the three men mounted up and rode away, dust swirling behind them like a vengeful ghost. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Amelia Dumont shuddered, hugging her belly. Wyatt wrapped an arm around her shoulders, tentatively half expecting her to flinch away, but she allowed it, leaning into him for just a breath. "They won't quit," she said, voice thinned by dread. "I know," Wyatt said, "but neither will we." Thus the storm took shape around them. The orchard with new buds of hope might soon be trampled by men who had neither mercy nor shame. Wyatt Granger found his old ghosts awakening. How many times had he tried to stand his ground, only to lose everything? He refused to lose her. Or the child. Not this time. Wyatt spent the next few days preparing for the worst. He repaired the barn door and blocked the broken shutters in the house with spare planks fashioning rudimentary barricades. A single rifle and 2 revolvers were all they had to rely on, plus a scattering of extra rounds he'd stashed from better days. Amelia Dumont, despite her advanced pregnancy, insisted on helping string barbed wire around the orchard's perimeter. He had reservations about letting her handle such tasks, but she refused to be coddled. One dawn, as Wyatt replaced cracked boards on the porch step, Amelia approached with an anxious expression. "I dreamed of them last night," she admitted. "They were searching the house. I couldn't stop them." He set down his hammer, placed a hand gently on her arm. "They won't just walk in," he said. "We'll see to that." She nodded, though worry remained etched across her brow. What if the law sides with them? The territory's rules can be twisted. They have money, or so they claim. He glanced out over the dusty yard, recalling the many times unscrupulous men twisted the law to evict him from his farm. "Then the law can catch bullets same as any man," he muttered, scowling. He'd never been one to condone violence as a first measure, but survival had taught him that bullies thrive when unopposed. "We'll do what's needed to protect you and the baby." The tension spiked on a windless evening when the sky turned bruise purple along the horizon. Wyatt was mending tack in the barn, while Amelia attempted to fix a tear in her single good dress. She had begun humming absent-mindedly, a small sign that some part of her had found room for calm, when a smell of smoke pricked Wyatt's nostrils. At first he suspected the stove, but the odor was sharper, more ominous. He rushed outside, scanning the gathering dark. In the half-light, an orange glow danced near the barn's rear corner. Flames licked at the aged wood, creeping upward with hungry intensity. A jolt of alarm shot through him. "Fire!" he shouted, sprinting for the well. Amelia stumbled from the house, eyes wide with terror. Instinct took over. Wyatt grabbed the bucket by the well, filled it with precious water, and dashed back to douse the flames. But the flames had spread quickly, almost deliberately. Sparks hopped along the tinder-dry beams, illuminating the orchard in eerie flickers. The old barn wood, so dry from seasons of neglect, caught like paper. He flung the bucket's contents at the fire, only to see more flames roar up from behind. "Damn it!" he cursed. He heard Amelia cough behind him, the smoke already thickening. "Stay back!" he commanded. She coughed again, tears in her eyes from the acrid sting. Get the horse out," she managed, voice ragged. Wyatt dropped the bucket, rushed into the barn's main door. The heat singed his face, and the overhead rafters glowed with embers. The horse stomped in panic, pinned by halter. With frantic hands, Wyatt loosed the rope, slapped the mare's flank. She galloped out, whinnying in terror. A crack overhead signaled a collapsing beam. Wyatt dodged the flaming timber, just in time. He stumbled from the barn coat, smoldering on one side, and collapsed into the dirt. Amelia ran to his side, though her condition slowed her. He sprang up, ignoring the searing pain in his left forearm. They retreated together, choking on smoke, as the barn let out a final groan and caved in, a hail of sparks. Neighbors from a distant ranch saw the glow, but by the time anyone arrived with a horse-drawn water barrel, the barn was lost, soot-stained and trembling. Wyatt stared in numb fury at the destruction. Amelia supported him, her free hand over her swollen belly. "They set this," she whispered, tears tracking through the grime on her cheeks. "They came just like they said they would." Wyatt nodded, breathing ragged. He could sense the malice behind such an act, possibly the in-laws or their hired men. If burning the barn was a warning, it was well delivered. They intended to push the household to surrender, to give up Amelia, or face ruin. Wyatt's thoughts churned. He'd lost one farm to unscrupulous men. He'd watch another burn before letting them take her. But for now, the damage was done. The barn was ash. The orchard scorched in places. The neighbors, silent and pitying, offered small consolations. "We're sorry. We can spare a day's help. We'd speak for you if the law came." That was something. But Wyatt suspected the real fight wasn't over. Amelia clung to his arm as if he was the only solid thing left in her collapsing world. Once the smoldering remnants cooled, the night's hush descended again, heavier and more foreboding. They collapsed inside the small house, exhaustion gripping them. Amelia tried to keep from crying, but her shoulders shook. Wyatt gently held her, letting his chin rest atop her head. "We'll stand no matter what," he murmured. She nodded. Breath quivering, and in that closeness they both realized they couldn't run from the confrontation. The men who set the fire wouldn't vanish. So Wyatt and Amelia would have to meet them armed with nothing but love for the unborn child and determination that soared beyond the flames. The next few mornings, Wyatt took stock of what remained. The barn was nothing but blackened beams and ashes. He managed to salvage a few tools from a corner that the fire didn't reach. The orchard's fringes had been licked by flames, but mostly survived. The house still stood, albeit dusted with soot. Beneath the despair lay a potent anger. He'd once let the bank run him off his land. Not this time. Amelia, for her part, wrestled with a swirl of emotions. Some days she tried to glean normalcy, cooking small meals or tidying the battered furniture. Yet the knowledge that someone would likely come again hung in every breath. She became prone to gazing out the window, eyes scanning the dusty road for riders. Her nights remained restless. Wyatt sometimes heard her pacing quietly in the darkness. One evening, as the sun sank in a hazy sky, they sat on the porch. The child within Amelia's womb kicked fiercely, prompting her to wince. Wyatt reached out a gentle, hesitant motion. She let him place his hand on her belly, where he felt the flutter of new life. A reverent hush fell between them, broken only when she said, "They want this baby, but they don't want me. That's the cruelest part." Wyatt nodded, jaw clenched. "They're after some twisted notion of legacy. They'll use the law or bullets to claim it." She held her belly protectively. "I won't let them." He glanced at her profile, still streaked with the faint ghost of tears that had dried. He recalled how he once lost a child, never got to hold it, never felt that flutter. The corners of his heart ached with sorrow for the past and fierce love for the present. "We fight them," he said simply. In the days that followed, neighbors from the next valley began to hear rumors of an impending confrontation. Some steered clear, unwilling to be dragged into a family feud. Others, hearts kinder than fear, offered discreet help. Extra boards, a bit of ammunition, or a place to hide. If needed, Wyatt accepted what was offered, forging it into a patchwork defense. When the in-laws finally appeared at dusk, they did so with more subtlety than he expected. No thunder of hooves, no bold knocking on the door. Instead, Wyatt on edge heard a rustle near the orchard as the last light drained from the sky. He grabbed his rifle, quietly, alerted Amelia. She doused the lamp. He slipped outside, belly tight with adrenaline. The orchard's shadows were thick. Among them, he saw 3 shapes, possibly more. Then a voice hissed, "Granger, come out and talk. Make it easy." He recognized the drawl of the bearded brother-in-law. Wyatt aimed the rifle in that direction, though the gloom made details fuzzy. "You want to talk? Show yourself in the open." A soft chuckle. "We don't want a shootout. The law's on our side, you know? We just want Amelia. We'll let you keep the land if you hand her over." Behind Wyatt, Amelia stood at the threshold, trembling but refusing to hide. She softly said, "Never." Wyatt shouted back, "The law would call you kidnappers." A new voice chimed in the younger man from before. "We got papers saying she belongs with us. A judge in Ironwood Gulch might sign 'em. We'll see if you can argue otherwise." Wyatt's mind spun. He had no official documents, no marriage license. They were never formally wed. Just a vow spoken between them under the battered roof of a house that had seen too many ghosts. That vow meant everything to them, but likely carried no weight in a crooked court. He pressed the rifle butt to his shoulder, heart pounding. "You'll have to kill me first." In the tense silence, an ugly cackle echoed, followed by the sound of movement among the branches. Wyatt braced for gunfire. Instead, one man raised a lantern, shedding flickering light across twisted trunks and battered bark. He aimed to spook Wyatt into shooting, but Wyatt held steady. That standoff felt like it might stretch forever, hearts beating in the dark orchard. Then Amelia spoke from behind, Wyatt voice loud and trembling, but resolute. "This child is mine. Daniel, my husband died, leaving me free. You sold me once. That was your choice. Now, I choose to stand with Wyatt. If you want me, you'll walk through his bullets and my curse." An uneasy shiver racked the orchard. "Superstitious or not," the men muttered. The bearded one spat. "We'll see about that. There's no curse but the cold truth. You're nothing but an item." But neither side fired, fear of mutual destruction. Perhaps the orchard was a tight space. Shots would risk their own men in the crossfire. After a tense moment, the brother-in-law signaled retreat. "We'll gather more men, maybe the sheriff. This ain't over." Their footsteps receded, leaving Wyatt and Amelia alone in the orchard's hush. The old fear flared in him, the memory of losing all when men with claims marched in. But Amelia pressed close, face tear-streaked, and he gathered her into his arms. "We hold the line," he whispered. She nodded. A single breeze shook the orchard's leaves overhead, as though the land itself trembled with them. Word of the impending showdown spread quietly through neighboring valleys. People who once turned away from Wyatt, Granger's misfortune, now kept a cautious ear open, uncertain if they dared intervene. The local sheriff, rumored to take bribes, might side with Amelia's in-laws, if paid well enough. Rumors suggested a hearing had been arranged in Ironwood Gulch for official custody of the unborn child. Meanwhile, the brother-in-law's men, a ragtag bunch with more temper than wit, gathered somewhere in the hills biding time. Amelia Dumont's pregnancy advanced by the day. She began to labor in her breathing, short gasps that concerned Wyatt. He feared the stress of conflict would send her into early labor or worse. Yet her spirit held. She continued cooking and kept the orchard alive with a determination that belied her exhaustion. Sometimes at dusk, she and Wyatt would stand outside, arms around each other, as if drawing strength from the waning light. Then, as if orchestrated by a cruel maestro, the day of reckoning arrived under a sky thick with gray clouds. Late afternoon, Wyatt was near the orchard, checking the battered fence line. Amelia sat on the porch, crocheting what might become a baby's blanket. In the distance, a swirl of dust announced riders approaching, possibly half a dozen. The tension in Wyatt's chest wound tight as a coil. He retrieved his rifle, checked the chamber, and loaded extra rounds into his pocket. Amelia noticed, setting aside her crochet. She rose with difficulty, wincing at a contraction or a twinge, but forced herself to stand behind him. "Don't risk your life," she murmured, voice tight. He turned, gaze locked with hers. "I'd risk everything for you and this child." The riders drew near, forming a ragged line at the ranch's boundary. Front and center was the bearded in-law, flanked by two men brandishing shotguns. A scrawny figure Wyatt recognized from the barn, burning fiasco, also hovered at the rear. Possibly 4 or 5 others lingered out of direct sight. One man wearing a star pinned half crooked on his vest, a so-called deputy, cleared his throat. "Wyatt Granger, the law states you must hand over Miss Dumont until a formal hearing. She's still family property by some accounts." Wyatt's anger simmered. "I see no lawful reason to comply. She's free by her own word. She's a widow with no debts." The brother-in-law spat. "We have papers in Ironwood Gulch. The hearing's set. Unless you want to spill blood, you better ride in with her peaceably." Amelia stepped forward, eyes aflame. "You want me? I say no. That's the only law that matters." She doubled over slightly, a spasm crossing her face. Fear jolted Wyatt. Was it a contraction, or just her body protesting the stress? He placed a hand on her shoulder, glaring at the men. "She's not going anywhere. If the real law wants to come, they can do so. But I see a deputy's star pinned on a man who looks more like a hired thug." Skulls formed among the posse. One man raised his voice. "Enough talk. We aim to take her." He leveled his shotgun. Time stretched taut as wire. Wyatt raised his rifle. Amelia gripped his arm. "Don't!" she whispered. But the moment had passed. A single shot cracked the air, fired by one of the in-laws. The bullet whizzed past Wyatt's ear, burying itself in the porch post. He responded instinctively, rifle bucking in his hands. One man toppled from his horse, howling. Chaos erupted. A second shot roared from the scrawny man, but it went wide, hitting the dirt. Wyatt returned fire, forcing them to scramble for cover behind scraggly brush and the orchard's edge. The in-law brother face, twisted in rage, directed his men to fan out. Amelia retreated into the house, panting from fear and a rising pain that gripped her side. Wyatt took cover behind a water trough, heart hammering like a drum. Shots pinged off the porch, rail shattered a window. He fired back in short bursts, mindful of limited ammo. The orchard's branches quivered under a hail of stray bullets. The men outnumbered him, but they had less skill. Then behind him, he heard Amelia cry out, not from a bullet wound, but from a contraction, a sob of agony. He turned, torn between defending the house and going to her. Another bullet splintered the trough's edge. Gritting his teeth, he fired one more round, nailing a man in the shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. That gave him a moment's reprieve. He dashed inside. Amelia was on the floor, sweat on her brow, eyes wide with terror and pain. "The baby," she gasped. Her water had broken a wet stain beneath her. Wyatt felt a surge of panic, a fierce protective fury. Outside, the gunshots continued sporadically. They were pinned. He crouched by her, swallowing the lump in his throat. "All right, we do this. You hold on. I'll push them back." She clung to his arm nails, biting into his skin. "I can't. Not like this." She whimpered, tears in her eyes. "You can," he said, trying to sound calm, though fear battered him. "I won't let them in." In that moment, a fierce love welled in him for her and the unborn child. He rose, rifle in hand, and locked eyes with Amelia one last time. "Stay away from windows," he instructed. She nodded, anguish contorting her face as a fresh contraction seized her. With determined strides, Wyatt stepped onto the porch, preparing for a final stand. He would buy Amelia the time she needed to bring their child into the world. If the orchard and the scrawny barn lot had to become a battlefield, so be it better to fight for something real, love life and a future, than to fade under tyranny. Wyatt crouched behind the shattered porch rail barrel of his rifle, scanning for movement in the orchard. His heart thudded so loudly he thought it might drown out the crackle of gunfire. The in-laws had scattered, taking cover among the orchard's battered trunks and half-burned stumps. Every so often a muzzle flash betrayed their position. He fired back, forcing them to duck. Inside the house, Amelia Dumont fought a different battle. The baby was coming, fast pains ripping through her body in relentless waves. She bit down on a piece of leather to keep from screaming, tears leaking from her eyes. Each contraction hammered her breath away, each minute feeling like an hour. She pressed a hand against her belly, half in prayer, half in desperation, repeating Wyatt's name in her mind like a talisman. Another bullet whipped past Wyatt's ear. He grit his teeth, searching for glimpses of the brother-in-law. The orchard leaves quivered. Then Wyatt spotted him, a hulking figure with a beard creeping from behind a trunk. Wyatt fired a warning shot that slapped bark and ricocheted. The man cursed, returning a volley that split the porch post. "Granger," the man roared, "give up and we'll let you leave alive. The child is ours by law." Wyatt's voice thundered back, "Law? This is just greed and cruelty. You want a child you never cared about." A hail of bullets answered him. The orchard tang rattled with echoes, an unholy choir. One found Wyatt's calf, slicing a ragged line of pain. He gasped, staggering back, rifle slipping in his sweat-slick grip. But he managed to keep hold. Summoning grit, he refocused. Pain meant he was still alive. Inside, Amelia moaned in agony, a fresh wave of contractions leaving her trembling. Her vision blurred. She recalled how Wyatt said he'd lost his child, how he never got to hold it. She refused to let that fate be repeated. Determination flared through the pain. If they wanted to tear her from this place, they'd do so over her dead body. The baby deserved better. A shadow flickered at the window. Amelia tensed, fear spiking. Another of the in-laws must have crept around the side. She heard footsteps near the door. Panic surged. She crawled across the floor, ignoring the searing in her abdomen, and snatched Wyatt's spare revolver from where he kept it near the kitchen's corner. She braced herself behind a half wall, breath-shallow, tears mingling with sweat. The doorknob turned. She aimed with trembling hands, her heart hammered like a drum. The door inched open, revealing a man with a crooked grin. He spotted her face, turning from smug to shock as he realized she was armed. For a moment, time froze each of them, confronting the lethal truth in the other's eyes. Amelia pulled the trigger. A thunderous crack filled the small room. The bullet struck the doorframe, sending splinters into the man's face. He howled, stumbling back, clutching his cheek. She fired again, a bit steadier. This time, the bullet caught his shoulder, spinning him out the door. Amelia panted, tears streaming. The recoil jarred her entire body, her belly twisting with renewed contractions. She collapsed, keening softly, half lost in the haze of pain and adrenaline. Outside, Wyatt heard the shots and realized Amelia was defending the house alone. Rage flared and he let out a roar, emptying 3 quick rounds into the orchard. One landed with a sickening thud, followed by a groan as another assailant toppled. The orchard's fight was turning. The in-laws, rattled by casualties, began to pull back. The brother-in-law bellowed curses, calling for retreat. Wyatt seized that moment, limping toward the orchard's edge. Rifle raised. "Run if you want," he thundered, voice ragged. "Set foot here again, we'll bury you." The men, bruised and shaken, remounted or dragged their wounded away. In a swirl of dust and battered pride, they retreated, leaving Wyatt's orchard and threshold behind for good. He exhaled a trembling breath, reeling from blood loss. But a more urgent call pulled him inside, Amelia's cry. He staggered in, found her on the floor, the revolver still clenched in her shaking grip. "Help me!" she gasped, eyes wild with labor pains. Without hesitation, Wyatt dropped to his knees, pulling her close. No time for formalities. The child was coming now. Wyatt commandeered what little water remained in the house, heating it swiftly on the stove. Blood seeped from the gouge in his calf, but he ignored it, focusing on Amelia Dumont, who lay propped against a pile of blankets, face contorted with pain. "Breathe," he whispered, remembering how he'd read a dusty pamphlet about childbirth, once back when he and Miriam had hopes. "You have to breathe slow." Amelia attempted to regulate her breathing, but each contraction gripped her like a vice. Her hair stuck to her face, sweat glistening on her brow. She clutched Wyatt's hand with a force that made him flinch, but he didn't pull away. He recalled the day Miriam went into labor and how quickly that turned to tragedy. He refused to let this story end the same. Time blurred, measured only by her anguished gasps, his reassuring words and the faint crackle of the stove's fire. The orchard outside was eerily quiet now. No more bullets, just the leftover hush of violence. He prayed that hush could remain peaceful, with trembling determination. Amelia bore down, guided by instinct more than knowledge. Wyatt supported her, wiping her brow, encouraging softly when she wept from the intensity. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a tiny cry pierced the gloom. A child's wail, frail but loud enough to jolt Wyatt's heart. He stared in awe at the newborn, slick with the miracle of birth. The baby's lungs expanded with a raw cry that signified life's unstoppable force. Amelia collapsed back, tears of exhaustion and relief streaming down her cheeks. Wyatt, fumbling with unsteady hands, used a strip of cloth to clear the baby's mouth, then wrapped the infant in one of the old towels. A boy, he held the child carefully, breath catching at the sight of those tiny fingers curling with nascent vigor. A swirl of emotions, relief, fear, joy, heartbreak ran through him. The memory of losing his own baby burned, but now in this moment, hope overshadowed that sorrow. He placed the child gently in Amelia's arms. She choked on tears, cradling him, as though he were the first dawn she'd ever seen. Wyatt let them have that moment, stepping away briefly to douse his own wound. The pain was real, but overshadowed by the magnitude of what had just transpired. Amelia looked up, voice trembling with exhaustion. He's all right." Wyatt knelt beside her eyes, scanning the newborn. "He's breathing. Crying." That's more than enough. The baby's cries subsided to soft whimpers, nestling against Amelia's warmth. She gazed down in wonder. They remained there in silence, the hush of new life settling around them. Through the open door, moonlight painted the orchard with silver. The chaos from earlier felt distant, like a bad dream, ended by the dawn of a child's cry. Only the scorch marks on Wyatt's pant leg and the bullet gouge in the porch post reminded them this was no dream. After ensuring the baby was stable, Wyatt checked Amelia's vitals. She was weak but steady. Breathing slowed now, relief shining in her eyes. She locked gazes with Wyatt, fresh tears brimming. "Thank you," she whispered. "Not just for saving me, but for everything." He knotted his own throat tight. "He's yours. Ours," he said softly. Something about saying ours made her exhale, as though she'd been waiting to hear that word. The land, the orchard, the battered ranch house, all of it bore witness to this child's arrival, an arrival that signified rebirth for them both. They named him quietly in those precious moments. a name that carried hints of Daniel, her late husband, and the spirit of second chances. Daniel Granger Dumont. Bridging the memory of what she lost and the future she was forging with Wyatt. And so, in the ashes of conflict, new life blossomed. Sunlight returned with quiet splendor. The next morning, Wyatt woke on the floor near the bed, having drifted off while keeping watch over mother and child. The newborn stirred, letting out a small squeak, hungry for the first feeding. Amelia, pale but determined, tended to him with a gentleness that made Wyatt's chest ache with a mixture of admiration and relief. Outside, the orchard shimmered under a fresh dew, as though the earth itself recognized a new beginning. Wyatt stepped outside onto the battered porch, surveying the property. The bullet holes and scorch marks remained silent testimony to the battle they'd weathered. But the sense of immediate threat was gone, at least for now. He doubted the in-laws would return soon, not after tasting defeat and the risk of bloodshed. The sheriff might attempt some half-baked legal measure, but the knowledge that the baby was safe here gave Wyatt impetus to fight any further claims. Neighbors trickled by in the following days, hearing rumors of gunfire and a baby born in the midst of chaos. They came with small gifts, some bread, a bit of sugar, extra cloth for swaddling. Wyatt accepted these tokens, though he'd rarely accepted help in the past. Amelia greeted each visitor with cautious gratitude, holding her newborn close. She kept his name to herself at first as though reluctant to let the outside world claim it. But soon enough, word spread. The child's called Daniel Granger. Dumont, they whispered. A name bridging mother and father, binding them in a final quiet vow. Wyatt wrote to the next county circuit judge, a man rumored to be more impartial. He explained the situation, how Amelia Dumont was harassed by in-laws who'd abandoned her, how they tried to forcibly reclaim her. He included statements from neighbors who'd witnessed the barn burning or the orchard firefight. The letter was a gamble. Maybe the judge would ignore it, or maybe a traveling marshal might come by. But Wyatt refused to let the old corruption triumph. In the meantime, he set about rebuilding the barn, though loss could be replaced in stages. He and a handful of neighbors raised a temporary stable for the horse. The orchard, lightly scarred by gunfire, still bore enough fruit for small harvest. He placed new fence posts to protect the orchard's perimeter from further intrusion. Amelia, despite her postpartum fatigue, oversaw the reorganizing of the house. She arranged each corner with care, as if claiming it for the child's future. Their relationship, once so tentative, found deeper footing in the daily tasks. They still didn't speak volumes, but the closeness was there. A stolen glance while Wyatt hammered nails, a gentle hand on Amelia's shoulder as she fed Daniel. Even the orchard seemed to hum, with quiet acceptance of the new family taking root. One afternoon, as the baby slept in a makeshift cradle by the window, Amelia and Wyatt stood in what used to be the child's nursery for Miriam, the old wallpaper half peeled. The memories of Wyatt's past and Amelia's tragic journey mingled in that space. She brushed a palm against the wall. "We can paint it fresh," she said. "Give him a proper room." Wyatt nodded. "I'd like that." Her gaze wandered to him, warm and unguarded. "I know we never had a formal ceremony, not by law, but I consider you my husband." He swallowed the roughness in his throat, betraying emotion. "And you're my wife," he replied softly. "No matter what papers say, I stand by it." In that simple exchange, they found a resolution more binding than any piece of paper. They had forged a union in adversity, sealed by compassion, tested by fire, and redeemed by new life. The orchard outside was no longer a battleground. The hush lingered, but it was a hush of dawn, not dread. The neighbors would speak of them as a strange pair: Wyatt Granger, the silent rancher with a battered hat, and Amelia Dumont, the quiet mother who once was sold behind a saloon. But that gossip would fade as months passed, replaced by stories of a ranch that thrived despite all odds, of a child who grew stout and bright, and of a couple who built something honest from the ashes of heartbreak. Seasons cycled once more over Ironwood Gulch, and the ranch at the foothills took on a fresh aspect. The orchard, pruned and watered, diligently burst with spring blossoms that perfumed the mild air. White petals drifted across the yard, a living confetti of renewal. The newly built barn, raised with neighborly support, stood proud, its red paint glowing in the early sun. Amelia Dumont, though slight in frame, moved with confidence across the yard, her child toddling at her side. Daniel had dark hair and an unshakable curiosity, forever trying to grasp orchard petals or the ears of a patient mare. Every day he learned something new, the taste of orchard fruit, the texture of hay, or the gentle bray of the donkey that replaced their old battered mare. Wyatt Granger watched them from the porch, arms folded lightly. A subtle warmth filled him at the sight. He was no longer that drifting ghost who spoke only in half sentences. He'd found a purpose in safeguarding this small family, in coaxing fruit from scorched earth. He wore his battered hat. Still, but behind it, faint lines of contentment creased his brow. News arrived by stagecoach, once that an official ruling from a higher court recognized Amelia's independence from her in-laws. The judge, upon reviewing the accounts of forced sale and attempted violence, dismissed any claims those men might have had on her, or the baby. The letter stated curtly, "Miss Dumont's rights supersede familial claims." Wyatt read it out to Amelia, who pressed a hand to her mouth and closed her eyes. Tears forming tears of relief, not sorrow. The orchard heard those tears rustling its leaves in approval. The in-laws never showed their faces again, having lost more men than they could spare. They retreated to some distant territory, brandishing bitterness, but lacking the will to wage another failed confrontation. The crooked deputy or sheriff from Ironwood Gulch offered no further intrusions. Perhaps they realized the tide of local sympathy had turned in Wyatt and Amelia's favor. Now, free from looming threats, the ranch found a steady beat. Wyatt taught Daniel to feed the horses, his small fists gripping oats with delight. Amelia planted rows of vegetables behind the house, coaxing life from the soil. Some evenings they all walked amid the orchard, listening to the quiet hush that was no longer a harbinger of dread, but a lullaby. Sometimes in the hush of night, Wyatt would recall how he stumbled upon Amelia's plight behind that saloon. The memory of her hollow eyes, one hand on her belly, the men bartering her as though she was livestock. He'd wonder at how a single desperate choice paying $50 and a rifle had led them both here. Not a perfect place, but a home. He'd slip an arm around her as they stood on the porch, or as they lay in bed, once the baby was asleep. And in that closeness, the regrets of the past eased. Amelia never forgot the fire that nearly consumed them, or the bruises from men who claimed her as a burden. But each day she found small proofs of resilience, the orchard that now bore fruit with sweet juice, the repaired barn that protected their animals, and the child's laughter that rang pure as a mountain spring. She no longer flinched at sudden sounds. Her nights were not entirely free of nightmares, but Wyatt's presence anchored her. They made no fanfare about official marriage certificates or ceremonies. In the eyes of most, they were husband and wife, forging a union of choice. The orchard's branches bore witness to more than just blossoms and fruit. It cradled their story of forging family under duress, turning fear into love. Occasionally, a traveling preacher or neighbor joked about performing a formal vow. They'd only smile, exchanging glances that said, "We're beyond needing that." On a warm afternoon in early summer, they pinned a newly stitched sign over the porch. Dumont Granger Ranch. Painted by Amelia's careful hand with a small depiction of orchard blossoms, that final act felt like a quiet declaration. No matter how the world once tried to break them, they'd grown roots here, strong as oak. When the day's work ended and the sun sank low, they gathered on the porch, Wyatt, Amelia, and little Daniel. They watched the sky shift from gold to lavender, a hush enveloping the land. But it was a peaceful hush, not the hush of horror or dread. In that hush, the orchard sighed contentedly in the breeze, as if saying, "This is right." Amelia leaned against Wyatt's shoulder, Daniel cradled in her arms, half asleep. The wind brushed them gently, and Wyatt said, "We made it." She nodded, her eyes shining. "Yes, we did." Their story wasn't one of spectacular heroics or grand fortunes, but it spoke of survival, justice, loyalty, and honor, all tested in the harsh code of the West. Two souls battered by sorrow found each other in a moment of silent defiance and turned it into a life worth living. The orchard, once neglected, now blossomed. A child, once threatened, now thrived. And two hearts that once knew only grief discovered they could love again, quietly, steadfastly, like the land itself. If you've been stirred by the rugged honesty and defiant hope in Wyatt Granger, and Sabor and Amelia Dumont's Beaux Espoirs story, then hitch your wagon to our channel, Beaux Espoirs. Like, search and subscribe, and follow. They be boss. For more frontier tales packed with dust, grit, and the unbreakable spirit of the Old West. We promise gunslinging showdowns, tender romances beneath endless skies, and the raw courage it takes to carve a life out of unforgiving landscapes. Saddle up and ride with us into the next saga, because out here every moment is a test of heart and steel.